Hi everyone, and welcome to the Cora's Quilts YouTube channel, where it's my mission to help you make stunning quilts simply. If we haven't met before, my name is Shelley Cavanna. I'm a quilt pattern and fabric designer, and I write quilting books like the Barn Star Sampler. You can find my fabric, patterns, and books at your favorite local quilt shop or online at my website at corasquilts.com. You can also find us on most major social media platforms under the handle Cora's Quilts as well. Today's video is part of a 12-month quilt-along series where we'll be working through the 20 blocks in my Barn Star Sampler book. To sew along with us, you'll need your fabric and a copy of my Barn Star Sampler book. Each of these construction videos assume that you've already starched and pressed your fabric and that you've followed the instructions in the book to cut and label your fabric pieces. If you're looking for more information about this quilt-along program or my thoughts on pre-washing or starching your fabric, you can find the link to all of the previous videos in this series in the description box below. There are no specialty rulers or templates required for any of the blocks in the Barn Star Sampler. The majority of our blocks are made using my favorite stitch and flip techniques to eliminate triangles and bias edges whenever possible. With the blocks that do feature triangles, we'll be piecing our triangle units larger than needed and trimming them down to size, so you won't need to worry about foundation or paper piecing templates either. I'll share a full list of all of the tools used in this video in the description box below, but if you'd like my entire list of our must-have and nice-to-have tools, you can find that information in our mise en place video, also linked below. In today's video, we're going to be taking a closer look at putting together our ribbon star and our mosaic star. These are blocks 10 and 11 in the book. Typically, we'll have individual videos for each of the blocks in this sampler quilt. However, these blocks are so similar that we decided to just put them together into one video. And we're starting with these two blocks because they provide a simple and easy introduction into my favorite stitch and flip methods of block construction. And stitch and flip techniques are really my favorite quilting techniques for making complex geometric shapes because they use only squares and rectangles. So that means we're not using any bias edges, we have no triangles, and again, no specialty rulers or templates. Before we start sewing, let's take a quick look at our block anatomy to understand the various shapes or building blocks that we're working with this month. Both of these blocks are essentially 9 patch blocks. They have 9 individual elements or building blocks that are sewn together in a 3x3 layout, or 3 rows of 3 blocks. At the center of each block is a square and square unit, surrounded on all 4 sides by flying geese units. We'll be exploring our stitch and flip techniques to make both of these units. The 4 corners of each block are where the blocks differ. Our ribbon star block uses solid squares in each corner, while our mosaic star uses a half square triangle for the corner unit. So let's take a closer look at how to assemble these 2 stitch and flip building blocks. A flying geese block is a rectangular block that includes 1 large triangle, often called the goose, with 2 smaller triangles sewn to either side. Some people call these smaller triangles the wings, and other people call them the sky. And just like so many of our classic quilt blocks, there are quite a few different ways that you can make these units. You can make them 1 at a time, you can make them 4 at a time, you can make them using all squares, with squares and rectangles, or even with 3 triangles. There are specialty rulers and foundation paper piecing templates, and even ways to piece them big and trim them down to size. But the goal of this channel, my goal as a quilting teacher, is to help you make stunning quilts simply. So today's video is going to share with you my favorite way to make flat, accurate, flying geese easily and without a lot of fuss. And this is using my favorite stitch and flip technique. So in addition to your fabric, you need 2 squares and a rectangle for each flying geese unit. You're going to want to make sure that you have some sort of a temporary marking tool on hand. And finally, it's also really important to mention here before we start working on our building blocks that if this is your first time using any of these stitch and flip techniques, I recommend practicing with some scrap fabric first before moving on to using the fabric for your actual quilt. We call this the stitch and flip technique because when you join a square to the corner of a larger background piece, like a rectangle, when you join them with a diagonal seam, you can then flip up the corner of the square and you flip it into place and it forms a nice, crisp, triangular corner without having to sew with triangles or with those stretchy bias edges. So the first step in making these kinds of blocks is marking our stitching lines on the wrong sides of our squares. In future videos, we'll explore how to make these kinds of units without using a marking tool, as well as how to repurpose some of those triangle trimmings. So if you're already familiar with this lined method and you want to work ahead, you can find links to tutorials for both of these topics in our video description box below. With the traditional stitch and flip method, the method where we're marking our stitching lines ahead of time, the most important thing to take into consideration is what kind of marking tool to use, and there are literally dozens out there on the market. My personal favorite is this 3-in-1 ceramic pencil from Soline. This pencil has ceramic lead, so you don't have to have all of the mess like you do with a chalk pencil. And it includes a dark lead for marking on light fabrics and a light lead for marking on dark fabrics, along with a pink lead that is more of a high contrast color. If you're not able to get a ceramic pencil, then you can also use a water erasable marker. And the reason that I recommend using either a ceramic pencil or this water soluble marker is because the lines that we are drawing, they are on the wrong side of our fabric, but these are our stitching lines. And so that means that there is a slight chance that the marking tool we're using could bleed through to the front of our quilt block when we fold that piece into place. And if any bleeding happens, if we've used a marker that's temporary, then we can go back and get rid of the mark. Otherwise, we're stuck with a mark on the front side of our quilt that shouldn't be there. Marking stitching lines is super straightforward. You just need to draw a diagonal line from corner to corner on the wrong sides of your squares. Using any straight-edged ruler will absolutely work here, but I want you to notice that it is my pencil tip and not the ruler's edge that I'm lining up with the corner of the square. If you line up your ruler's edge with the corner, then your stitching line is going to be offset from the center a little bit. This is the number one mistake I think people make when they are piecing these kinds of blocks. If your ruler's offset, that means that your block is going to be offset as well. So set yourself up for success by making sure that it is the pencil in the corner and not the ruler when you draw your lines. Once you've marked all your stitching lines on the wrong sides of your squares, you're ready to start sewing. Just place your marked square right sides together at one end of your background rectangle, lining up the corners and the edges. You can secure the square in the corner with a pin if you prefer, and then all you need to do is sew on that marked line. If you're not a fan of pinning, but you need to keep your blocks from wobbling around as you sew, you can also add a little dab of washable glue in the corner that will be trimmed off. I really like this washable glue pen from Soline. It doesn't matter whether you attach that first square to the right end or the left end of your rectangle, you're going to get an identical block either way. And if you have multiple blocks to piece, you can also save yourself quite a bit of time by chain piecing your blocks. Once you finish piecing one block, just take a couple of stitches past the edge of that block and start sewing your next block without snipping your thread. This way you can do all of your trimming and all of your pressing for all of your flying geese blocks at once. Now that you're done piecing the first half of your blocks, go ahead and snip the threads between your chained blocks and you're ready to start trimming and pressing. You need to trim away the excess fabric in the corners of your unit, leaving a 1/4 inch between the seam allowance and the edge of the block. You can absolutely use your rotary ruler and cutter here and measure exactly 1/4 of an inch away from the seam, but that does take a little bit of extra time. Instead, my preferred method is to trim away the excess fabric with my nice fabric scissors and just sort of eyeball that 1/4 inch seam allowance. This is the back of the block, and we don't need this to be a perfectly accurate 1/4 inch seam. It's okay just to estimate here. The resulting triangle trimmings are small, but you can absolutely save them. You can set them aside to be repurposed later as leader or ender pieces or for a mini scrap quilt, and we'll be sharing some ideas for how to reuse these triangles in a future video. After trimming your units, you're ready to start pressing. We are pressing these seams directionally towards the sky portion of the block or towards the corner we just attached. I prefer to press with a hot, dry iron and will press each block while it's closed first to set my seams. Then I use my fingertips to move the corners into place before pressing it with the iron. Once I'm done pressing my blocks, I'll leave them on my wool felted pressing mat to cool off, and I often place a tailor's clapper or a heavy object on top to kind of help these blocks cool nice and flat. If I have a stubborn corner that just doesn't want to lay flat, rather than using the steam on my iron, I will mist it with a little bit of water from a spray bottle or hit it with this flatter product, which is a non-starch-based pressing aid. Oftentimes by adding just a little bit of moisture and re-pressing, that's enough to get those stubborn corners to lay back flat. After you've finished pressing, you're ready to attach the second corner using the same technique you used to attach the first. We just want to make sure that our diagonal line is crossing over our previous seam rather than running parallel to it. So if you've got those crossed over, then all you have to do is stitch on the marked line. To finish the blocks, simply separate your chains if you were chain piecing, trim your seam allowances down to a 1/4 inch away from the seam, and then press your units towards the corner you just attached, just like we did with the first side of the block. And there we have our stitch and flip flying geese block. The second building block used in our ribbon star is the square and square unit, or sometimes it's called a diamond in a square. And this is a simple quilt block that features a center square set on point, surrounded by corner triangles. These stitch and flip square and square blocks are going to use the exact same technique that we just used with our stitch and flip flying geese blocks. The only difference between the two units is that instead of a background rectangle, we're using a larger background square, and instead of adding 2 stitch and flip corners, we'll have 4. If you haven't marked them already, then go ahead and mark your stitching lines on the wrong sides of your smaller squares. Then place one of these marked smaller squares right sides together in one corner of your larger background square, being extra careful to line up the edges of both squares. Pin or glue based if that helps you to keep them stable while stitching. Just like our flying geese units, all you have to do is stitch on the marked line. When you've finished attaching the first corner to the background square, you can actually go back and also attach your second smaller square to the opposite corner. This way you can do your trimming and pressing for 2 corners at once. Keep in mind though that this only works when you're pinning them in opposite corners. That's because these 2 seams won't overlap at all. Trim off the excess fabric 1/4 inch away from your seam line. Remember that you can absolutely use your rotary ruler and cutter here if you're more comfortable this way, but this trimmed edge is on the back of our blocks, so I like to speed things up and kind of eyeball that 1/4 inch seam and trim them by hand. And just like our flying geese units, we will be pressing these towards the smaller corners that we just added on. I like to press them with a dry iron, and I'll press them while the seams are still closed to set that seam before moving the corners into place with my fingers and gently pressing the blocks. Once you've pressed those first 2 corners, then you're ready to start attaching the remaining corners. Stitch on the marked line, trim, and press, and then you're finished with your stitch and flip square and square units. Once you've finished sewing your flying geese units and your square and square units, then you are ready to join those building blocks along with some corner squares together into your ribbon star. Lay out your building blocks and corner squares as shown in the assembly diagram in your book. Make sure that each peak on the flying geese unit is pointed towards the peak or corners of the square in square unit as shown. The first step is to sew all of the units together into horizontal rows. The top and bottom rows don't have any seams to match, so they're really quick to sew together. With the middle row, we need to do our best to get the peaks of our flying geese to kiss the points of our on-point squares without cutting either point off. The easiest way to do this is with some super sharp, extra fine pins like these clover glass head pins. To help keep the points aligned while you're sewing, pin them together by passing your pin from wrong side to right side at the seam intersection of the first block. Then pass the same pin from right side to wrong side through the seam intersection of the second block. Some people prefer to stitch with this pin just dangling, marking the spot. You can also secure things a little bit further with the addition of 2 pins, one on either side of the first. I like to carefully secure that middle pin, being very careful to not shift the points around that I've just worked so hard to mark. Once you've pinned your flying geese units to the left and right sides of your square and square unit, you're ready to start stitching. You might find that using a tailor's awl or a stiletto is very helpful for preventing seams from folding back on themselves as you sew. Keep stitching up until just before the place you've marked with your pin, and then remove the pin. As you sew, you want the needle of your machine to pass just a thread's width or 2 above the place that you'd marked. Finish your seam and then continue on with the seam on the second side. Before you head to the ironing board, take a quick peek at your points to make sure that you're happy with how they meet. If you've accidentally cut off a point, then don't rip out the entire seam. Just pop out 6 or 7 stitches on either side of the problem area, then repin and re-stitch. If you find that you're consistently cutting off points, then try joining your blocks with a scant 1/4-inch seam, or a seam that is just a few thread widths smaller than a true 1/4-inch seam. Once you finish joining all of your blocks into rows, then you're ready to press. I find that I get the most accuracy by having my seams nest rather than by pressing them open. Each assembly diagram in the book shares my pressing suggestions. So for this block, we are suggesting pressing the seams in our tops and bottom rows toward the corners and away from the flying geese unit. The middle row, we'll be pressing the seams away from the flying geese units towards the center of the block. One of the reasons I really like piecing with an 80 weight polyester thread is because the thread is much skinnier than 50 weight cotton thread. Thinner thread means flatter seams, which means that even though this middle row has some bulk to it, it's still possible to get it to lay fairly flat. I've also found that pressing on a wool pressing mat, which absorbs the heat from the iron and reflects it back into the back of the block as you press, also really helps to flatten those otherwise bulky rows. The pressing instructions in the book, though, are really more pressing suggestions. So if you personally have more success pressing your seams open, you should absolutely do whatever works best for you. Finish the block by attaching the top and bottom rows to the middle row. If you're using nesting seams, first line up the edges of your rows and then sort of slide the seams together until they butt up right next to one another. Secure with a pin to keep everything in place before moving to the other end and nesting that second seam. Finally, go back and line up the middle of your row by matching up your flying geese and square in square points. Go ahead and pin the top and bottom rows to the middle row before heading over to your sewing machine and stitching those final seams. Then finish off the block by pressing your seams. I find that it helps my seams stay even flatter if I take the time to set my seam first with the block closed before gently opening the blocks with my fingertips and pressing the rows into place. Now that you've put together your ribbon star, you're ready to go ahead and start on your mosaic star, which is block 11. And this block is going to be assembled just almost the exact same way as the ribbon star. You're still going to make your flying geese units for the compass points. You're going to make your square and square unit for the center of the block. And finally, we're going to learn one last technique in this video, which is putting together some 2 at a time half square triangle units for the corners. So when I was writing the patterns for all of the blocks used in the Barnstar Sampler quilt, one of my goals was to eliminate as many triangle and bias edges as I could. So while it's really easy to make a half square triangle block by sewing 2 half square triangles together into a whole block, it's even easier to make this kind of a unit starting off with 2 squares. And as promised, with as many of the triangle units as possible in the book, we're going to piece them larger and then trim them down to the correct size for maximum accuracy. So we start making our 2 at a time half square triangle units the same way we started making our flying geese and our square and square units earlier in this video. We're going to draw a diagonal line from corner to corner on the wrong side of one of the squares. Again, just a reminder here that you should be lining your pencil up with the corner of the square, not your ruler, so that you're ensuring your line goes directly down the middle of the square. Then pin this marked square right sides together with the square of the same size from the second print. Sew a 1/4 inch seam on both sides of the drawn line. Before you separate your half square triangle units, give them a quick press to smooth out any rumples that happened while you were sewing. Then simply cut the unit in half along the marked diagonal line. It's alright to do this carefully with scissors, and you can do it with your rotary ruler and cutter as well if you're more comfortable that way. Press the seam allowances as suggested by the arrows in the assembly diagram in your book. Finally, trim the unit to the size indicated in the pattern. It's very handy here to use a smaller rotary ruler with the 45-degree angle marked. Line up that 45-degree line on your ruler with the diagonal seam line of the unit. Before trimming the right and the top sides, do make sure that you've left yourself ample room along the bottom and the left edges to still square the unit to the size indicated in the pattern. Rotate the unit so the newly trimmed sides align with the correct marks on your ruler, and keep that 45-degree line of the ruler lined up with your diagonal seam line. Trim again along the right and top edges of the ruler to finish squaring up your half square triangle unit. Once you've finished piecing all 3 of the building blocks for block number 11, lay them out in our 3x3 pattern. First, sew your blocks together into rows, and then sew your rows together, practicing the precision piecing techniques that we learned about with block 10. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Remember that you can share your quilt along progress photos over on Instagram using #BarnstarSampler, and be sure to tag us at Cora's Quilts so that we can see your photos too. And don't forget to grab your free Barnstar Sampler Quilt Along Block checklist. We've left a link to download it in the description box below. If you've enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and make sure you're subscribed to our YouTube channel. Happy sewing, and we'll see you soon with another Barnstar Sampler tutorial.